Okay, good morning, everybody, and good afternoon and good evening, depending upon where in the world you are. And welcome to the Freedom of Association Summit of 2021. This is first of 4 sessions that we're having this week. So just to get us started, a few technical points to help you listen and to help you to participate in this session. First of all the presenters will be speaking English today, but there is interpretation into both French and Spanish. So if you need interpretation, click on the symbol of the globe on the bottom of your screen and select the language that you want. If you need any technical assistance, please select Martina Hooper in the chat and send her a message. And also, as a reminder, this session is being recorded and it will be available at electronicswatch.org at the end of the session. So my name is Björn Claesson. I'm director of Electronics Watch. And let's see, we will soon be turning to the panelists of this session and Omana George, who will be moderating. But first of all, we would like to explain why we're talking about freedom of association at our annual summit. So Electronics Watch, as many of you know, is an independent monitoring organization for more than 300 public buyers in Europe and in Australia. We help them to work together to protect the rights of workers in their electronic supply chains. One consistent theme that we see in our monitoring is that workers rarely have a meaningful voice in their workplace. They are reluctant to talk to outsiders about working conditions, fearing that they could lose their jobs if they were discovered. They may not have access to effective grievance processes to address conditions of work and employment. Worker committees and occupational health and safety committees are often missing, even if they are mandated by law. And leading companies in this industry have an extremely low union density. Even where there are independent worker unions, they may not be able to effectively bargain with their employers. And this is a troubling situation because the freedom of association and the right to collective bargaining are fundamental in the terms of the International Labor Organization. They are fundamental human rights, irrespective of the level of development of the countries, because they are a precondition for other rights. So these rights provide a necessary foundation for workers themselves to be able to strive to improve their conditions at work. In our experience, where these rights are respected, where the freedom of association and the right to collective bargaining are respected, conditions of work are better, independent monitoring of compliance with labor standards is easier, the human rights and environmental due diligence process works better because there is a grievance process and workers can more easily join both investigations and the remediation process. And from a public buyer perspective, it is easier to ensure social responsibility in your supply chains where these rights are respected. Yet, outside of the union movement, there is insufficient attention overall to these fundamental rights. With regard to the electronics industry, companies are far more likely to address and report on issues relating to working hours, occupational health and safety, and forced labor in their supply chains. It is rare to see mention of freedom of association in social audits or in public reporting. With respect to public buyers, they lack important tools to effectively monitor and enforce workers' rights to form or join unions and bargain collectively with their employers. Our aim in this summit is to illuminate how pivotal the freedom of association and the right to collective bargaining are to protect the rights of workers, and why this should be a core concern in public procurement. If we want to improve occupational health and safety, we need better respect for freedom of association. If we want to eliminate modern slavery, we need better respect for freedom of association. If we want living wages, we need freedom of association. If workers do not have a meaningful voice in their workplace, sustainable progress on any of these issues is difficult. This is why freedom of association is a key strategic focus for Electronics Watch. We started this autumn with workshops for our monitoring partners, how to monitor and how to document violations of the freedom of association and the right to collective bargaining. We held workshops with our affiliates to explore how to drive demand for the freedom of association in tenders and in contracts. Now, at this summit, we hope to inspire public buyers and all of you to join us in making the freedom of association and the right to collective bargaining a central strategic focus of your work as well. Thank you. And now over to you, Omena.
Thank you, Bjorn. Hello, everyone. My name is Omena George, and I'm the monitoring coordinator at Electronics Watch. Really happy to be here with all of you today for the opening session, which is on freedom of association, the climate crisis, and modern slavery. In the next hour and a half, we'll be looking at what is the connection between FOA, climate crisis, and modern slavery. Is it possible for us to solve the climate crisis or end modern slavery when workers cannot exercise their fundamental rights to organize and bargain collectively? We have a great line of speakers today who will take us through these topics. They are trade unionists, Electronics Watch monitoring partners, and academic researchers. Now, let me start by first introducing the agenda to familiarize you with the flow of this session and introduce our speakers we have lined up for you today. So we start first, Bjorn, can you show the slide? Thank you. We'll start first with the introduction of the panel, and then we'll go on to our first speaker, who is Dr. Camila Alvarez. She'll be talking to us about her research on the analysis of unionization and carbon dioxide emissions. And then we will move on to a discussion on freedom of association and its role in building solidarity. We will have two speakers in this discussion, Stein Sintubin and Maria Eminenta. After this, we will move to our second segment of discussion, and this one is going to be about the impact of mining in Palawan in the Philippines. Here we will have two speakers again, Shigeru Tanaka and attorney Grizelda Mayo-Anda, who we will call Gerthie. Finally, we come to our last presenter for our session, who will be from California. Both Dr. Camila and Dr. Anibel are from California, so both their sessions will be recorded presentations. Dr. Anibel will be talking to us on the freedom of association and why it is essential to abolish modern slavery. We'll then move on to a question and answer session, and then we will wrap up. And finally, at the end of 1.5 hours, we'll have a 30-minute session where we just open the floor for all of you to interact with the speakers and get to know them and speak further about the presentations which they did earlier. Now, let me introduce our four speakers. Our first speaker is Stein Sintubin. He's the director of the European and International Department of ACV-CSC, Belgium. ACV-CSC is the largest trade union confederation in Belgium with over 1.6 million members. For years, Stein has maintained the relationships between ACV-CSC and trade unions and trade union structures in Asia. He runs the policy and training programs with unions all over Asia. Since 2016, he delivers a special program which develops activities on social dialogue and networking of trade unions in multinational enterprises and their supply chains, focusing on Cambodia, Indonesia, Philippines, Bangladesh, Myanmar, and on the garment and construction sector. Our next speaker is Maria Eminenta. She is from the International Department of the Confederation of Indonesia Prosperity Trade Union, which is known as KSBSI. Maria is responsible for tackling the internal and external organizational issues on climate change and just transition. She is a member of the Indonesian National task force on climate change issue and an observer for the government policy and program on this issue. She's also the national coordinator for Indonesia Trade Union Alliance on Just Transition. Maria is the program coordinator of the International Institute of Workers' Education, IIWE, which is a trade union program initiated by ACV CSC Belgium for the Asia Pacific region. And she is responsible for the coordination of Indonesian and Cambodian trade unions under this program for networking of workers in international companies and supply chains. She's a graduate from the University of Trikaria Medan, South Sumatra, in the field of finance and banking. Our next speaker will be attorney Grizelda Gerthie Mayo-Anda, Executive Director, Environmental Legal Assistance Center in the Philippines. Gerthie established ELAC in 1990 to empower communities and local stakeholders to assert their environmental rights and protect the natural resources. Using the science of policymaking, she advocated and developed policies to stop extractive projects in natural forests and key biodiversity areas, about reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, clean air management and coastal resource management, and many others. Our final speaker is going to be Shigeru Tanaka from the Pacific Asia Resource Center, PARC, in Japan. He is the director of PARC, a people's think tank based in Tokyo, and works to connect various social movements for common purposes. Since 2015, Shigeru has been engaged in on-the-ground research to assess human rights and environmental impacts of mining projects in the Philippines, Ecuador, Brazil, and Canada. He is also a member of the Japanese consortium of NGOs called Ethical Keitai Campaign that examines supply chain due diligence trends of Japanese electronics companies and advocates for better management practices. Now, before we start, I want to get our session going by asking you a question each. To Maria and Stein, I'd like to ask you, why do you think freedom of association is important for workers? Maria and Stein?
Thank you, Omana.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me also to speak to this workshop today. It's a very interesting initiative that we as unions, of course, we like this type of meetings with public buyers and so on, opportunities to explain important topics like freedom of association. Yes, I think Bjorn did already a very interesting introduction into why that freedom of association and the right to collective bargaining is so important. For us, these two conventions, 87 and 98, the International Labor Organization conventions, they provide us really the enabling rights for our work as trade union. They provide the rights for all the rights for the workers. If we don't have freedom of association and the right to organize and collective bargaining, we don't have anything. Meaning, because these conventions, they regulate and provide us the means to, as a worker, to join a workers' organization, a trade union, or any other type of organization. They provide us the freedom as a union to form unions, to organize workers in companies, to enter into companies, and to formulate also our proper program. So the activities that a union does for its workers and to defend the worker rights, and sometimes that can go from manifestations to strikes. So that's also included in the freedom of organization element. So it describes and provides us our mandate to work and to be active in the companies. But freedom of association is not something natural. It's not something obvious. It's something that trade unions, even now, because these conventions are conventions which were agreed between governments, employers, and unions already at the beginning or half of the 20th century. And we still have to fight daily to have this type of rights. So it's not something that we get. It's something that we have to continue to fight for. And it's also not something that it's just in the developing countries or in the global south or in the lower tiers of the supply chains that workers don't have these rights. That's not true. It's even in developed countries, even in highly industrialized countries, we see that the violation of negotiation and the negation of freedom of association is a huge problem. Here in Europe, for example, workers are still excluded from freedom of association and the right to organize in food delivery workers like Uber, Deliveroo, Takeaway, or the workers in the platform industry, which is a new sector, and also a sector that works in the electronics industry, where freedom of association is almost unknown. The workers don't have the right to organize. We have Amazon, we have Ryanair, so many companies where we still are struggling for freedom of association. Yearly, it's maybe an interesting element also to look up afterwards when using the concepts. Yearly, the experts committee of the ILO publishes a list with countries that are violating the conventions 87 and 98. And for example, the list of 2020 and 2021, it included countries like Canada, Brazil, Japan, Austria, Denmark, Romania, Turkey, South Africa. So not directly the least industrialized and poorest underdeveloped countries either. Even in Belgium, so my country, we had recently a very serious case of violation of freedom of association, where 27 trade unionists were convicted to prison and to fines because they blocked the road during a manifestation. And so this is against the mandate that we have and our basic rights to mobilize and defend the rights of the workers.
Thank you, Stein, for that introduction. And we will come a little bit further on to talk much deeper into this topic with both you and Maria. Now, let me ask the intro question to both Shigeru and to Attorney Gerthie on why is it important for the people of Palawan to have a voice?
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to Electronics Watch and all our colleagues for inviting us here. It's a very interesting summit. Palawan is an island ecosystem, and it's considered the Philippines' last ecological frontier. And as such, it actually is biologically diverse and species rich. You have about more than 1 million people there. And it's very important for people in Palawan dealing with climate change, dealing with a lot of extractive and development activities, to actually be heard that their natural resources, which are being threatened, are very important for their survival. These natural resources, these forests, mangroves, coral reef areas, the fishery resources, they need to make sure that these resources are there not only for now, but also for the future. Because without these resources, they would have difficulty dealing with the challenges of climate change. So, and that is also their right. In addition to what our colleague has mentioned, in addition to ILO, there are so many international agreements that actually gives a strength to the need for that voice. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you both for your sharing. Now let me move on to the first speaker of this session, Dr. Camila Huerta Alvarez. She is the Assistant Professor of Sociology at the University of California, Merced in the US. She is the lead author of Is Labor Green? A cross-national panel analysis of unionization in carbon dioxide emissions. Much of her research is focused on integrating theories from the sociology of race and ethnicity to environmental justice issues. So we're going to see now in her presentation about the methods she has used for gathering data and analysis. And she obtained her PhD and master's in sociology from the University of Oregon. This is a recorded presentation. If you have comments and reflections, we can discuss it afterwards, and we can also send her your questions. Thank you. Bjorn.
We're not hearing the sound from the video.
Bjorn, we can't hear the sound.
I am sorry about that. That is a shame. I'm not sure what to do about that right now.
Should we move to the
Hold on a
first
second.
discussion, and then we can, yeah.
Okay.
Bjorn,
What try right now?
Because, you know, research
that's
builds
it.
on previous research.
You
and
can hear
things
it?
like that.
Yes, yes.
And so
Perfect.
previous work has showed that societal activity contributes to carbon dioxide emissions.
Bjorn, would you put it
And
back to the
when I
beginning?
say societal activities, this work looks at the social drivers or various social indicators, such as the size of the economy, total population, or the type of the economy. And so this type of work is looking at ways to measure
Bjorn,
aspects of the society or that reflect the
needs to
society.
start from the beginning.
Should I start it all the way from the beginning?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Brilliant. Thank you.
At the University of California, Merced, and my areas of expertise is looking at the relationship between social inequalities and how do they influence environmental problems. And today I'm going to be talking about research looking at the relationship between levels of unionization and how are they associated with carbon dioxide emissions. So where I want to get started for today's presentation is I want us all to get situated into what is the work that I'm building on, because, you know, research builds on previous research and things like that. And so previous work has showed that societal activity contributes to carbon dioxide emissions. And when I say societal activities, this work looks at the social drivers or various social indicators, such as the size of the economy, total population, or the type of the economy. And so this type of work is looking at ways to measure aspects of the society or that reflect the society in like the gross domestic product per capita, or the percent of people who live in urban areas, or like the percent of the economy that is in the service, or the percent of the economy that's in agriculture, et cetera. So they're looking at these various sort of indicators that reflect larger patterns that are happening within the society. And it's important to be looking at that because if we can sort of understand what is associated with greater environmental problems, then we can better understand how to address it. Now, this line of work has also been looking at labor conditions. And the way that they look at labor condition is by looking at the number of working hours, or looking at the percentage of union density, or looking at the percent of part-time workers. And again, this is to get a better understanding of how do these various sort of statistics reflect what is happening in society. Now, before I get into the specifics of what I did in my research, I want to take a little bit of time to talk about why is it important to be looking at labor conditions. A large portion of carbon dioxide emissions are contributed by the economy, and labor is essential to understanding the economy. And so when we want to think of the labor conditions and the workplace and labor in general, we know that that is an area where a lot of economic and management decisions happen. And we also know that that can be an area of political advocacy. So we can think of how do labor conditions sort of facilitate, mediate, and contribute to environmental conditions. And also not only that, looking at how do they contribute to environmental issues, but understanding how do different parts of the labor dimension, what are their different types of magnitude? Because like I had just mentioned in the previous slide, there are various ways to measure this, like number of working hours or percent of unions, percent of part-time workers, and understanding those different facets. So now let's look at the empirical evidence of this work. So the work that I have done with my colleagues is I look at 34 countries, and these are countries that are members of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And I look at data from 1970 to 2014. And so the light blue nations are the countries that were included in the study. And I connect the OECD data with the World Development Indicators data, which reports a lot of various statistics on all sorts of things like the economy, social, health, and the environment. And I want to talk a little bit about the specific variables that I looked at. So for the dependent variable, or the outcome variable, I looked at carbon dioxide emissions per capita in metric tons. And the outcome variable or the dependent variable is the variable that we're interested in explaining. So the carbon dioxide emissions per capita is the environmental problem that we're looking at and that we're interested in explaining. And so we also want to, because we're interested in explaining it, we want to sort of include variables that we think are important in explaining it. And the main predictor variable or the independent variable that we're interested in looking at is the percent of workforce that is unionized. So that's the main variable that we're looking at to understand how does that associate with carbon dioxide emissions per capita. Now, like I had mentioned before, there is a lot of research out there on various social drivers to environmental problems. So we want to include those important control variables to see, does the main predictor of interest, is it significant even with the presence of these important control variables? And so I'm going to talk about the specific data or the specific method I used. But first, I just want to sort of show you a scatter plot of union density on the x-axis and carbon dioxide emissions per capita on the y-axis. And this sort of shows you how is this sort of laid out. But the reason why I'm showing this is because this is just all countries and all times, right? It's not it's not ordered in any way. But on the right-hand side, I have the same graph, but I have it color-coded by country, and you can sort of see that there's a lot of clustering happening for various countries. So as a statistician, I need to control for country clustering as well as time clustering. And the way I do that is by using a multi-level approach where I nest my data, I group my data based on country, and I control for time. And this is to account for the clustering that is happening in that previous scatter plot I showed before. So now I'm going to actually show some of the results from the empirical work. Before I show that, the way I'm going to demonstrate it to you all is through what is known as a coefficient plot. And this plot, you look at the red line, and if the blue line intersects with the red line, that shows that it is not statistically significant. And if it doesn't intersect, then that means that it is statistically significant. So let's take a look at these variables. So we have all of the variables reported here, except for the time variable. And we can see that union density is reporting a negative value, and it is statistically significant. So what this is telling us is that for every 1% increase in union density, there is a 0.03 metric ton decrease in carbon dioxide emissions per person. And this union density variable is consistent even in the presence of other major economic, social, and labor conditions, including GOP, number of working hours, and those sorts of things. So what this data tells us is that, or what we have found from this data is that we find that higher levels of union density are an important indicator of lower carbon dioxide emissions per capita, and that this trend holds true even with various control variables. I just want to, close by saying that these are systematic trends of labor conditions and their association with environmental problems. But of course, unions are not a monolith, and it's important to contextualize these numbers with on-the-ground experiences. And so I'm going to include my presentation with that. If you have any questions, please feel free to send me an email. Thank you so much.
Omana, we don't hear you.
Yeah, sorry. We just heard Dr. Camila's presentation, and I want to summarize by presenting a couple of points to you. In her presentation, we see the systemic correlation between unionization and carbon dioxide emissions. When a workplace is unionized, workers have a role in how the workplace functions, whether it's labor rights or environmental issues. Workers' rights and environmental responsibility are really two sides of the same coin. So I leave you with these comments, and I would like open the floor. But before I ask for feedback and comments, I just want to check in with Stein and Maria, whether they have any thoughts on Dr. Alvarez's presentation.
Maria, let me starting. She said, so I will go ahead. She can add. Yeah, I think I think we agree with Dr. Camila. Of course, it doesn't surprise us. This is not my area of specialty. Maria is far more on transition and on climate change, but also in other OECD studies, it's very clear that companies where there are unions there are better wages, there are better occupational safety and health protection. And that's just to the fact that in companies where there is a better working conditions and which are unionized, unions will start to work and negotiate with the employer in a more comfortable way, less on rights and on workers' conditions, and far more on elements that are also of interest of the employer. And so at that moment, you get a very interesting cooperation that can have a lot of societal impact. So therefore, social dialogue is an element for political and social stability, also economical stability. So,
thank you. Maria?
Yes, Omana. So it's I
Yes.
think it's very interesting study, and I think it's labor density. It's not significantly to the carbon dioxide emission, but it's significant more in the side of the production of the company, the place he or she working for. But it's unfortunately they are the most affected by these elements. So it's very important that they can also play a role for the emission commitment, and also to minimize, to avoid for the very negative or the high impact of the climate, of the carbon dioxide, and when this also will impact also to their workplace. So for the workers, it's more as the level of awareness, because they are not environmentalists. We are more in the unionists, but it's important for workers to understand the situation. But the most important is to save the people. For union, it's more important to save people. Yes, take care for the environment is important, but to save people, to save the jobs, the decent jobs, so they will not the one be a victim of the effort to cut the carbon dioxide emission. I think that's important elements also in this topic.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you to both of you. It's really good to hear your perspective as trade unionists. Now, I will just, are there any questions or, any feedback on this presentation? Maybe one or two comments, because we're really lagging behind time and I want to catch up now. Martina, is there any questions in the chat? Or any comments?
No, not yet.
Okay, so perhaps we can move on because we're really late. Okay, I'm just going to move on then. We have some time at the end to talk, so maybe it gives people some time to reflect on the presentation and there can be comments later. We now move on to the next section where we will be discussing with Maria and Stein on their work as trade unionists. We already heard from Stein a bit at the beginning about why freedom of association is the core for workers' rights and why it is really fundamental for workers, to be trade unionists. It's the core of their work. So now let me ask you both, when a worker is not able to exercise their fundamental right to organize or form a union or bargain collectively, what will be the impact on their lives, work, and health?
Yes, Omana, let me be the first, then maybe later add by Stein.
Okay.
So I want to share some of the screen to explain I will just give some of the example to answer this question, because it's through these two pictures we'll see how some experience we are facing in the field. From the first pictures, you see situation about wage negotiation. Members of KAMI Parho, it's one of the national federation in Indonesia for food, beverage, hotel, and tourism companies.
So Maria, can I just interrupt just a second? For the interpreters, could you possibly speak a bit slower and perhaps closer to the microphone? Is that possible?
Yes, Martina, of course.
It makes it easier for them.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
So I want to explain some of picture I saw here. that maybe start from the first picture here. We can show that the, sorry, it's moving too fast. Some of the experience facing by members to have negotiation on wage at their company level, because this negotiation in the palm oil companies to get wage increase for outsourcing and temporarily contractual workers to access the same level of wage with permanent one, because most of them treated differently. In most of class of workers in Indonesia, minimum wage is not ideally as the safety net wage. This huge violation still taking place, and many workers still struggling to get the minimum wage. So trade union very busy to check when it's problem facing their members and advocate those are facing problem to access it. And furthermore, in Indonesia, the regulation offer the bipartite negotiations to increase wage. As one of the example, the implementation of structural scale wage still quite low. It's less than 1% company apply to it. So it's quite important to organize them, to form union that will defend them to get their fully rights. Otherwise, workers will stay with low wage, undecent and difficult to bring family to the more quality life, hard to access health protection scheme. So other example in the second picture is about occupational safety and health protection due to the existing regulation that is quite old since 1970 and no more update. Then we need to negotiate the better implementation at the field, at the company level by proposing occupational safety and health management to complete the adequate the tools of occupational safety and health to protect them during work. And furthermore, recently in the COVID pandemic era, that OSHA became very crucial element. So if you see this picture also for very important to protect women workers from list of risky reproduction protection from chemical material like fertilizer in palm oil company, problem to access maternity and menstrual leave lead to bad health condition, children care program for better quality generation. So this is all about family and the next generation. The other example is about the platform workers. In the beginning, Sen also explained about it. It's not, they are not covered in the formal working relationship. Still no right for freedom of association. Then also no right for the collective bargaining. It's made them very weak. No position bargaining, only covered by social security, by only by personal scheme, and it's very expensive and tends to face a problem every time, everywhere, like accident as the example that potentially happen on the road for platform transportation workers, for example, and worsening situation by losing their income when it happens. So they are only some of the examples. Still many typical of workers in different sectors will facing similar difficulty in this life. So that is some of the example we can explain to you in this question. Thank you.
Thanks, Maria, for illustrating how being a part of the union and organizing helped workers to better protect themselves, their health and life. Now let me move on to Stein. Can you tell us a little bit more about the program of ACVCSC and illustrate how you're building solidarity from Belgium to Indonesia and other parts of the world in this program to protect workers' rights? It'll be great if you can share some examples of your joint work and solidarity.
We're working, or we provide a program to the to trade unions in Asia, which is like many other of our colleague trade unions, in which we offer the possibility for trade unionists and unions in Asia or in other continents to strengthen their capacity. Our program is mainly focused on negotiations, collective bargaining, social dialogue, and also on supply chains and multinational companies. Maybe Maria can elaborate a little bit more about that afterwards. I can give some examples of the last years of which that provide a little bit of solidarity, or which resulted in agreements coming by small contributions and work from our program, but also together with many other NGOs and many other unions from other areas. I don't want to claim the result, certainly not, but it's some examples of to what solidarity can lead. And I think everybody heard about the Rana Plaza disaster in April 2013. More than 1,000 workers died, 2,500 injured. After that, we started together with the unions in Bangladesh, unions from Belgium, unions from other purchasing countries, the United States, Canada, all over Europe, start to negotiate and push the brands to recognize the problem, and to push also to work on solutions in Bangladesh, in those type of factories in the textile industry. So there we agreed in a first accord, an agreement on fire and building safety. In 2021, we negotiated the second one. The first one was only for Bangladesh. Now we have one that we can even expand to other countries. So that's one example. Another example that I could give is together with the Indonesian Textile Union, the union of KSBSI, and other organizations, the Clean Clothes Campaign, among others, we could push brands to negotiate with the unions a protocol on freedom of association, meaning that we could establish a kind of multi-stakeholder agreement that guarantees access of the workers and the access of the unions to the workers in the companies, which is legally and binding. Other elements that we do is we try to facilitate South-South exchanges so that one union from the South learns from an experience in another union from the South. I give again the example. In 2016, I think Indonesia, KSBSI Indonesia went to Brazil, UGT, to work on and to learn from the Brazilian colleagues of how to integrate climate change and trade union work. In 2019, quite recently, just before the pandemic, we had an exchange of unions in Myanmar, together with the Myanmar Textile Union and the Confederation, to discuss freedom of association and other rights in the process of digitalization in the textile industry. So we try to put unions together also and make them exchange and learn from each other.
Okay. Maria, I want to ask you, as a regional coordinator of IIWE, what are the steps and education work your union has been doing in order to look at issues like gender equality and build women leadership in your union?
Yes, Omana. So we have, for a bit long time, we have good supporting and attention from ACBCSC. They're able to see the problems we are facing the partner and facilitate sufficient discussion, not only with them, but also with number of advanced trade unions. So gender issue is one of the important elements with a good progress in Indonesia. In my organization, KSBSI, that since 2007, we able to have the stronger gender equality commission with voting rights. So it's a very strong position in the organization that by constitution we put like 40% of quota in the trainings, decision-making bodies, etc. Then we also have some of program we developed it in the fields with the So we established also the gender counselor, because this is an important issue in Indonesia with huge violence and harassment at the working place, but also in the domestic violence. Then it's like it's not very much open for people to talk about it. So gender counselor to facilitate workers, members to face how they are facing their problems, and also kind of resilience when it's necessary. And we established also the Provincial Equality Commission in different provinces, because Indonesia is a big island with different provinces, as to help the national work in mainstreaming gender and the trade union work, like also to create the women negotiator. That's very important to bring the gender issue at the company level for all the violence, as I was explained, that's still huge problem. So important for them to speak up at the company when having possibility potentially collective bargaining agreement. So to bring up this topic in the negotiation. And we also very active in the Convention 190, just the recent ILO Core Convention for violence and harassment at the workplace. Yeah, to push the government to ratify it. And also, as some of the example, we try to establish a factory-free GBV, gender-based violence zones. Some of the model that also very effective, especially in the garment and some of the factory in Indonesia. So I think so far, women leader as also, if you see, very active movement in this picture of Indonesia KSBSI women leader, and our president also now women, the first women president of Trade Union Confederation in Indonesia. So I think that's some of our progress by supporting of the ACBCSI program for trade union in Indonesia, in KSBSI.
Thank you. And now I want to move on to ask you about what your union has been doing to address the issue of climate change and the impact of environment. What kind of, are you having any educational programs for building awareness in the future generation of your trade union members and workers? Any thoughts on this?
Yes, I think since 2011, we already working on this issue, and maybe we are the only union to very much concerned on this issue. So for the raising awareness for the members, we are having specific training on the climate change. So it's actually more in the personal raising awareness, and also the family of workers, so that they can pay for the global commitment for the emissions. But not only that, we also try to intervene the country, the government program on the climate change. If you see here in the middle, as I explained, it's the specific curriculum module of the 5 main topic in the KSBSI and the climate change. Here, this one is one of the big program until now. But we also very active in intervene the national, the government policy and program about the climate change. And the one of the recently the very great program in Indonesia is analysis for the phase call out. So for this program, KSBSI also asking the roadmap, the clear roadmap from the government, because actually so far there is not very much clear about this. They're planning to stop the coal production, coal mining until 2050, but it's not very clear how it's going. Not only for this mining, coal mining, but also for the 5 priority sector that putting in the national determined contribution and in NDC, and also long-term strategy for low carbon climate resilience. So we having as presented in the beginning, I am also the coordinator for the Trade Union Alliances, the 7 confederation with 17 national federation, trade union alliances, to respond to the government asking for the specific institution in the tripartite base to respond, to have advocacy and to assist the process of the Indonesian policy and program for the carbon emissions. So this is all the action in the environment protection for the environment action, but also to balance it with the how to balance it in the employment aspect. That's the reason why the just transition is very important element in this case. That's, I think, my sum of points for this issue.
Thank you. Thank you, Maria. Before, in the interest of time, because we are really running late, I want to ask both of you if you have any final thoughts, because many people in the audience are public procurers who are working to protect the rights of the workers in the supply chains, and any comments or final remarks as trade unionists for them to consider in their work.
Well, I just would like to come on the topic of global supply chains and look into that, because I think Electronic Watch and also the work that Electronic Watch is doing in raising awareness and working with purchasers, but also in production countries with unions and with workers and with organizations is very important. And this is a kind of, how you say, this is a kind of pushing and making employers and purchasers aware about what is happening. Still the huge violation of freedom of association, of all type of rights, of collective bargaining, which are the essence of an improved industrial future and more sustainable society in the end also. And so we had already for 50 years, I think, more or less, we had a lot of soft law and initiatives from employer side, from company side, from the government side, and we don't see too many changes. And that's a main problem for the unions in the companies. Yeah. The pressure for implementation of this type of soft law is not there. So at this moment, we are working hard to get effective and hard legislation, so hard law, and to obtain human rights due diligence in legislations. So at once that we could have this type of instruments of human rights legislation, due diligence legislation, it would be very clear for us. We would get extra instruments and tools to defend ourselves in these companies, but also the companies could prove far more easy that they are taking it serious, labor violations, and that they work against labor violations in the companies in the production countries, or even in the global north, and that they don't just do something for washing their image. So that would be an essence, and I know that Electronic Watch is one of those who are pleading for this type of HRDD or human right due diligence instruments. And I would like also to ask the public buyers which are participating and other colleagues that are participating to help us in the support of this type of legislation on national level. In Europe, we have already some countries like Germany, like France, in Belgium, we're working on it, but also in UK, there are initiatives, but also on the international level to get a real UN binding treaty on human and business rights. So that would be a great help.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Stein. That's a good message for our audience to think about. We'll now thank you both for your time. And if you have any questions or comments, you can post them in the chat box or send it to my colleague Maria and Martina, sorry, and we'll have a Q&A session at the end for all speakers. Now we move on to our next set of speakers, Attorney Gerthie and Shigeru. Thank you for joining us today. I'm going to start off by asking Attorney Gerthie, tell us where you come from and what is so special about your island.
Gerthie, you're muted.
Sorry. Again, I'm very pleased to have been invited to this forum. Palawan, as I mentioned, is the Philippines' last ecological frontier. It was chosen 4 times as the best island in the world by a lot of tourism and travel groups. And it is described that way because of its rich biodiversity. So we have 1,780 islands. Unfortunately, poverty is high here, but we pride ourselves that the remaining old growth mangroves are found in this province, and we have a high level of endemism, and we have the most number of protected areas in the country, 2 World Heritage sites, and we are UNESCO Man and Vice Reserve. Yes.
Okay. Why is Palawan very significant now in the global supply chain of electric vehicles, and why is it an important part of the climate crisis dialogue which is going on? What is its place and why is it so important?
Okay. Palawan's, particularly southern Palawan, is mined for nickel. The province is very rich in nickel, and therefore there's a lot of nickel mining, specifically in southern Palawan. And we have many mining companies that covers, the mining operations so far would cover almost 3,000 hectares, and there are plans for expansion for another 3,000. And nickel is an important mineral that's being used for electric vehicles. So that's why it assumes a significance in that context.
Okay. And what are the issues with regards to mining which is impacting Palawan? Could you share a little bit more about that?
Yes, okay. I have a few photos. Nickel minerals are found in forests. So you really have to remove all trees and forests to be able to get the nickel. And indigenous peoples actually are part of the areas. The mined areas or the proposed mining sites are ancestral territories. And that is why it becomes doubly important because their cultural heritage, their lives are dependent on a healthy forest. Besides deforestation and community displacement, there's also pollution. Farmlands have been inundated by the nickel laterite, and we see as well that that has affected their livelihood. So we do have cases where farmers have complained about low supply because of the inundation of the farms by nickel mining. Now, there are policy issues. That's one very important issue on the free and prior informed consent. We do have laws, but the problem is the enforcement of these laws. And the Mining Act itself needs to be amended so that the government of the Philippines gets a fair share as owner of the minerals.
Okay. Shiguru, could you tell us about what is the impact you've observed in your environmental study done in the mining area in Palawan, and how has it affected people?
Yes, so thank you very much for this opportunity. My name is Shigeru Tanaka, based in Tokyo, and we have been monitoring mainly 2 mine sites in the Philippines with relation to supply chains with climate change and a transition to low carbon technologies. And as Gerthie just said, they're both nickel mines. And as you've seen in the photo that has been shared just a couple of minutes ago, they just rip off the vegetation from the surface. Because nickel ore only exists in shallow parts of the earth, it doesn't make sense to dig deep. So you can't just take one place and dig deep. You have to dig widely. And this is the same with Indonesia. Because of the way nickel ore exists, you just have to rip off the whole vegetation from the place. So there's that. And then there's also water pollution that comes with that. So because you're bringing out minerals from underground, when it rains, heavy metals join the runoff water and it hits the rivers and it pollutes the rivers. So from what we've seen at least 1 river that runs through a mine site in Palawan where hexavalent chromium levels are exceeding WHO safe drinking water standards. And it's been that way for at least 10 years.
And what is the impact of hexable and chromium when it goes into the body, into the human body?
Well, that has been very well documented, and it forms the basis for the standards by OSHA and WHO. One is that it's carcinogenic and causes cancer. The other is that when it hits the skin, it causes skin irritations. So we have already seen children who has bathed in the polluted water with skin rashes. We have not been able to document direct relations to cancer, but the most obvious symptom is a skin disease.
Okay. Can I ask both of you, how do you engage with workers and communities on the impact of mining, who rely on these jobs for their livelihoods, so that they can be empowered to be agents of change by representing themselves, by articulating their demands in the mining operations? How are you all doing this?
Okay, that's a challenging question, Omana.
Yes.
And that's excellent, because you cannot really easily access the mining areas except for indigenous peoples, indigenous peoples and the farmer communities. But some of the relatives actually who work there are able to convey to us their own experiences. And therefore, they are part of the efforts that we have done for information education. It's very important to simplify concepts, like minerals, forest, health, well-being, ancestral territories. Those concepts have to be simplified and interrelated, and we need to document the experience. So it's a combination of documenting their experience, not only through their stories, but also photographs, and also bringing in the science and also the law together, because rights are very important, and the remedies as well on how to pursue this. Like example, years ago, the laborers were complaining that they had no security of tenure in that mining company. So there were labor cases. So it was very important that when there was a new permit for an expansion, when that was being tackled, so that was an issue raised. But you see, they do not have access to information. So that is very important. Second is advocacy work. Constant advocacy, engaging with government agencies. And last, from where I work, we do engage into environmental public interest litigation, EPIL.
Okay.
But that is chosen, of course, because it's time consuming and tedious.
That's a lot of challenging, different interventions you're doing there on the ground in Palawan. What do the people of Palawan want? We have nickel ore deposits there. We have mining companies going through the lands. What do the people want?
We are agriculture and fisheries based ever since, for a long, long time. We are not really, mining started in the 70s, but the Palaweños actually survive through fishing and agriculture, non-timber forest products. And we actually are the biggest source of fish in the Philippines. So we really need to maintain our coral reefs, our seagrass beds, and mangroves. And we have survived through agriculture and fisheries for a long, long time. So it's very important that territorial security for the farmers, the fishers, and most especially for the indigenous peoples are addressed. Because until now, despite the law, their ancestral territories are still heavily threatened. And also good governance. It's sad that the Philippines is one of the most corrupt countries in the world, and Palawan is the exemption to that. So we do have a lot of infrastructure projects, top-down, planned projects, which actually put at risk the livelihoods of people. So we do want good governance where decision-making processes come from below. And then finally, we want biodiversity and our natural resources protected, not only for now, but for the future. Because that's important, as I said a while ago, to enable us to survive and deal effectively with climate change. An important element for our resilience.
And for your future generations.
Yes, future generations.
Yeah. So finally, I want to ask both of you, do you have any take-home message for this audience on mining and the impact it's having in Palawan, and any action that they can take?
Okay, like our colleagues Stein and other colleagues from
Maria.
yeah, I'm inspired by their stories and
Yes.
even our speakers, and we're learning from their experiences. For us, it would be good that the concept of justice, you see, is actually articulated in the way that we purchase our goods. We
Yeah.
have to check. My message is to our fellow citizens of the world. We have to determine the sources of our nickel. Okay, whether the mining was really done fairly and whether it should be in an area where mining should be allowed, because you have to weigh in the value of biodiversity vis-a-vis, versus the minerals. And then second, if they can help in any way by providing us information and enabling the people there to have their voices heard. That to us is very important. I know that the campaigns are very important as well, like Shigeru-san could tell more about that, but that is an added value to the work that we do. It has been very difficult doing this for more than 30 years now, and we continue to be strengthened by efforts of our colleagues all over the world who have done their share supporting us in this effort. Thank you.
Thank you. Shigeru, any final thoughts?
Yeah, well, there's a lot actually that I'd like to say, but just to condense it a little bit. So one thing that is very difficult for us in working with the workers is that in these mining communities in the Philippines, for example, the workers live in these gated communities with armed guards in the front. And we are not able to go into there and ask about the situation of working conditions or whether they have any freedoms in their workplace. And from stories from other residents is that it is not necessarily a good condition to work in. There's a lot of temporary workers. There's a lot of wage theft going on. And in general, so what is happening is that there is a situation of impunity for the mining companies. And so Attorney Gerthie, her main topic that she covers is the environmental issues, the biodiversity issues in the island. And our colleagues who spoke before us work with the workers. And what is common there is that both of us, we do not want to let the companies go with impunity when they are breaking international agreements, when they are breaking existing domestic laws. And so we find it very important that the public buyers externally adds this pressure and demands that the companies in the supply chains defend human rights, defend the environment. And in that sense, I think that is where the trigger is. And going back to our first presentation, my theory is that there's not this one causal relationship between unionization and environmental protection, including CO2. In our experience, we see, for example, cases where the environmental protections come first, and then that gives the opportunity for workers to say, well, if they care about environment, then why don't they care about us? Or vice versa. If you care about workers, why don't you also care about environment? So in various situations, one part becomes the breaking point, and then it has a domino effect from there. And we don't know what works in each situation. So I think it's important that we hold hands together and that we work with these international buyers and public buyers so that various pressures come from various directions, hoping that one place will penetrate through.
Thank you so much, Shigeru, for summing that up very beautifully. Thank you both for taking us into Palawan, making us understand what is going on in the ground over there and what the people of Palawan want. Now we move on to our final speaker, Dr. Anibel Ferus-Comelo, who is from the University of California, Berkeley. She is directing the Community Engaged Labor Studies program at Berkeley. It is a multi-organizational collaborative initiative that she develops prioritizing class, race, caste, and gender equity through collective organizing and public policy. And She brings a multilingual, transnational, analytical lens to her scholarship on supply chains, migration, and development. So let's listen to what Dr. Anibel has to say about freedom of association being essential to abolish modern slavery in global supply chains.
Okay, and I hope that the sound will work now. And if not, I rely on some people to just shout out that you can't hear anything, but I'm starting it now.
Okay.
Hello, my name is Anibel Ferus-Comelo, and I'm based at the University of California, Berkeley.
No, cannot
Many
hear.
thanks to Electronics
Can't
Watch
hear.
for inviting me to address you at this annual summit. My core message to you is
can
that
hear?
freedom of association and
Yeah,
the
I
right to
couldn't
bargain
hear.
collectively
It
is
looks like others
absolutely
can hear.
fundamental to promote positive outcomes for working
So
people
just
around the
please
globe,
continue, Bjorn.
including the
Yes, that's fine. We can hear. Beyond the video stopped. We can't hear you.
exploitative practices are endemic to contemporary supply chains across sectors and geographies. The electronics industry is no exception. Manufacturing and assembly of electronics hardware alone employs approximately 18 million workers who produce 20% of global imports. The global market for electronics was 4 trillion euros in 2017. This represents enormous unharnessed consumer power to raise standards for electronics workers. And buyers like you represent the most important leverage in that equation. Freedom of association is critical for workers' rights and environmental protection. The highly fragmented, complex network of relationships among brands, contract manufacturers, and their multi-tier suppliers are characterized by significant uneven power with huge differences in profit margins. As you can imagine, a business model based on downward pressure for price reductions and limited legal responsibility has adverse consequences for workers along the supply chain. The International Labour Organization describes forced labor in terms of the 11 indicators listed here, including debt bondage, deception, retention of identity documents, and excessive overtime. The terms forced labor and modern slavery are used interchangeably to refer to working and living conditions that are contrary to human dignity. Modern slavery is not an aberration of the choices of a few bad social actors. Forced labor is the predictable outcome of structural business models that profit from exploitation, governance gaps, social and legal discrimination, and deeply entrenched power imbalances between workers and employers. Workers are afraid to speak out without legally enforced protections. Brands and retailers are blind to practices in the far reaches of their supply chains. And governments fixated on economic growth are deaf to workers' pleas for respect and dignity at work. Modern slavery occurs at the extreme end of a spectrum of labor abuses. Prevention efforts must include the promotion and protection of workers' right to organize and collectively bargain in a framework of workplace democracy. Freedom of association is an enabling right to allow workers effective participation in economic and social policy through non-state actors such as unions and other civil society organizations. It is the first of 4 core human rights that are enshrined in the 1998 ILO Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work, along with the right to collectively bargain and work that is free of discrimination. The right of workers to form and join organizations of their own choice and engage in collective bargaining with employers ensures that workers have a voice and are represented as key stakeholders in their workplace. There's plenty of evidence from different parts of the world, if we ask the right questions of the right people, that electronics production involves various forms of modern slavery through human trafficking, bonded labor, and prolonged contractual employment. Workers are sometimes employed on a casual basis without proof of employment that would allow them to seek redress for rights violations. Without the legal status as employees rather than interns, apprentices, and so on, they are deprived of regular statutory minimum wages. Employer-provided accommodation for a price that workers pay can be substandard and is used as a form of labor control, making workers captive audiences for extensions of their workdays. These hostels and dormitories are secured with physical barriers that inhibit workers' mobility and prevent contact with people outside their work environment. In other words, restricting workers' freedom of association. And workers are often subjected to involuntary work overtime without additional pay or eligibility for social security benefits. Buyers like you are in a very strategic position to push for greater enforcement of workers' freedom of association. I summarize this as doing your part. Electronics Watch provides an effective model for context-specific remedies. First and foremost is the promotion of labor rights, including freedom of association and collective bargaining. Forced labor conditions often take advantage of workers' structural vulnerabilities based on race, caste, gender, religion, migration status, and debt bondage. All of these force people into exploitative conditions. So, promotion of anti-discrimination and equity-based labor rights, as well as an end to gender-based violence and harassment, contribute to preventing forced labor conditions. And a key antidote to forced labor is worker agency to monitor, report, and negotiate for decent work as defined by the ILO. Second, to work in alliances for greater impact. Buyers need to engage with local civil society like independent trade unions and workers' organizations because they can play an important role at each phase of enforcement. Third, respond to forced labor with the 3 Rs by insisting upon a remediation fund, robust retaliation protections, and revocation standards with the burden of proof for genuine, independent oversight. Fourth, transparency. The enforcement process and due diligence activities need to be more transparent with consistent reporting, dialogue, and information sharing between companies, civil society, and labor petitioners throughout the enforcement phase. All of these, the promotion of basic labor rights, effective alliances, institutional response, and greater transparency can only be built upon a strong foundation of workers' involvement through their democratic representatives. And this happens through the freedom of association. While robust enforcement of existing laws is a key tool, enforcement alone is not enough. The freedom of association, or the right of workers to join together to take collective action, is the most effective defense against forced labor. And freedom of association cannot be exercised without freedom of speech and assembly, or in contexts where workers fear retaliation or experience discrimination at work. We, the international community, should collectively use our influence and resources to expand space for civil society and labor activists to be able to protect and promote workers' freedom of association everywhere, especially in high-risk regions. Thank you so much for doing your part in safeguarding workers' core human rights at work. I welcome questions and comments for further dialogue.
Thank you to all our panelists for your presentations. Now I will open the floor for questions, comments. You can just unmute yourself if you wish and speak directly, or you can give questions to my colleague Martina and she will read it out to the rest of us. Please go ahead and ask your questions or comments. Thank you. Okay, there is, Martina, there's no questions?
No, not at the moment.
Okay, I have actually a question to Shigeru and Attorney Gerthie, which I would like them to explain a little bit more on the current government policy towards mining operations in Palawan. Is there any changes or any, anything in terms of how mining operations are working and for future expansions? If you could comment on that, it'll be really good for the audience.
Okay, thank you for that question. Actually, it's again challenging because under a previous executive order, Palawan is supposed to be a no-go zone for mining. Unfortunately, that was lifted a few months ago, and because of that, there are new mining applications, Omana, for expansion. So I was telling you a while ago that while we have almost 3,000 hectares of forest destroyed, there's another more coming in, and that will be probably, yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you. It can be about 5,000 hectares if allowed. Example one is in Bulanchao mountain range that actually is about 3,600 hectares of forest, and that's all natural forest. So the policy really needs to be revised and has to take into serious account the value of biodiversity, because scientific studies have already established that the value of the forest far outweigh the value of the minerals. That's why I was talking about advocacy efforts to be able to push government to protect our natural forest. Palawan was affected by Typhoon Haiyan in 2013, in the north especially. But right now, even this part of southern Palawan has been suffering from flooding in the last few months. So that's why you do not need a typhoon, just heavy rain can make communities really vulnerable. So that is an agenda, a continuing agenda we have, Omana.
Okay, thank you.
I will just briefly add on that this is the picture of Mount Bulanjal that Gerthie was just talking about. And the area that is stripped of trees, this is where the current mine and the related facilities are. And this covers about 900 hectares. Mm-hmm. And this is planned to expand to 3,600 hectares. So it will be 4 times the current size. And it is planned to not expand lower, but higher in the mountains, which means it will inevitably go into different valleys and affect various other rivers. Right now, it's just this river in the foreground. But if this becomes 4 times bigger in the upper side, then it will affect likely more than 40 rivers in the local area. So
basically, all the water supplies to the indigenous communities will be affected.
On this side of the mountain will be.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Shigeru. We are coming to the end of this session. So I would like to formally close the session and thank all of you for your time and participation. I once again want to thank all our panelists for your presentations and for sharing with us about your experiences and also giving us points to ponder and look at how to address the issue of climate change, forced labor, and in relation to freedom of association, and how the voices of workers and the voices of people should be a part of this conversation. I want to leave you with a slide, which is about the session tomorrow, which is on what is freedom of association, challenges to organizing in the electronic supply chain. It will start at the same time tomorrow. We will leave this room open for the next 30 minutes for those of you who wish to stay back and speak to the panelists. And it will be an informal session, and I welcome all of you to stay behind. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time, and see you tomorrow.